So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all to this panel on academic freedom and democratic leadership, autonomy versus accountability. I'm Gitanjali. I'm the moderator for this very, very wonderful panel. And I'm going to cut very quickly to the chase and lay out a few questions that I hope will sort of be the kind of broad canvas for which or on which our various speakers can come in on whatever they wish to speak on. So very quickly, because we expect to have a very diverse audience, I think it would be helpful just to be clear on what we mean by academic freedom and the different steps we'd like to take to ensure it, provided we all think it's a good thing. Is it an absolute thing, academic freedom? Second, what ought to be the relationship between a university, public or private, and government-led regulatory bodies? Our experience in India, of course, has been one of extreme closeness. A lot hangs on that relationship. And going forward, as universities, states, societies must, what should that relationship look like? Third, what is the role of the university in promoting democracy, democratic values, and producing democratic or democracy-minded citizens, as it were? Fourth, what is the role of all stakeholders in promoting academic freedom, from students to faculty, university leaders, and administrators, of course? And finally, in a time of crisis or an era when democracy is being eroded in various parts of the world, sometimes all around us, what is the role of the university in keeping democracy alive through its practices of academic freedom? So now I'm going to quickly introduce each of our five extremely accomplished speakers. I'm going to, provide a very short bio, but actually all of them have bios very worth going through. So please look at their web pages. And so our first speaker today is Professor Sabu Padmadas, who is Associate Dean International at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Southampton, United Kingdom. He's also a professor of demography and global health at the Department of Social Statistics and Demography. He's been at the forefront of internationalization at the university in steering major academic partnerships and research collaborations with top universities, research institutions, and think tanks in Asia and Africa. He's also been recognized by the university for his contributions. Our second speaker today is Professor John Clammer. He is Professor of Sociology at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and has been on the faculty of Jindal Global University for 4 years now. Prior to this, he was Professor of Comparative Sociology and Asian Studies at Sophia University in Tokyo, and then Professor and Advisor to the Rector at the United Nations University. He has taught and researched all around the world, and just to name a few places where he's had posts: Oxford, Weimar, the Australian National University, Buenos Aires, and many other places besides. Our third speaker today is Professor Alexander Fischer. He is Professor of Law at Jindal Global Law School. He specializes in comparative constitutional law, and before joining Jindal Global Law School was a lecturer at SOAS, the School of Law, University of London, and at the South Asia Institute at the University of Heidelberg. He's also been a visiting scholar in several institutions, including the University of Wisconsin Law School, as well as the Center for the Study of Law and Governance at JNU in Delhi. Our fourth speaker is Professor Souvik Bhattacharyya. He is currently Principal Academic Advisor, TCG Crest, a research institute. He's actually trained as a mechanical engineer and has held a number of faculty positions, notably at IIT Kharagpur. He has also served as Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University. He's been Dean and Deputy Director of IIT Kharagpur and Vice Chancellor of BITS Pilani. He's also a very well accomplished researcher, having published more than 250 articles. He's a member of a number of research bodies as well, recognized research bodies. Our final speaker today is Ms. Linda Brown. She is president of Torrens University at Australia. She's also CEO of SEI ANZ, Strategic Education Incorporated. She has a background in a very diverse background, incorporating leadership experience in the areas of private, public, government, social enterprise, commerce, and education. So I think we are set to have a wonderful conversation. I would ask all the speakers to restrict their comments, at least their opening comments, to 10 minutes so that we can have a discussion after. As I mentioned earlier, at around the 9-minute mark, I'd probably remind you that you have a few minutes left. So without further ado, I hand the floor to Professor Padmadas for his comments.
Right. Thank you, Gitanjali, for that wonderful introduction and for organizing this panel. And my thanks and congratulations to JJU for actually coming up with this exciting, I would say that, well, this is really truly global, and I think you have really made that that landmark to actually bring all of us together to this platform. And also, I think the admirable leadership of Professor Rajkumar is extraordinary. I think in terms of how he brings together, how he manages to bring together people to one forum to discuss issues that are of paramount importance in the kind of across global universities. So today's topic, I think, academic freedom. I think I should really start by saying that it's all simple as driving a car on a motorway. Well, it is. You have to drive carefully. You have to drive, responsibly, and you're also at the end accountable for any errors that you make. So that's exactly the best way to start an analogy of academic freedom. Well, I would certainly say that, well, 99.9% of the academics, I mean, globally, I think they follow that ethical standards. They follow the moral responsibility. They also follow the social responsibility, and they are also academically accountable for their actions. But there is actually sometimes 1% or less than 1% of the academics, sometimes because of circumstances, they tend to really break that circle. So it's just like for every boundary there is for every space there is a boundary and limit, and I think here this is important. But for universities, I think that's actually the kind of epitome for producing scientific knowledge. And I think we are responsible for this. So we have to really be careful, and we have to be accountable. But having said that, sometimes, you have also circumstances where people are forced to really break that ceiling, and that's where the trouble starts. But more generally, I think the freedom is required actually to produce new ideas, innovations, and also, I think, sometimes we forget how much science contributes to the society, I mean, in today's world. And today, exactly as we speak about sustainable development goals and so on, it is a scientific community that brings together that knowledge, that wisdom, experimentation, and so on. So that, I think, none of these would have happened without that freedom. One best example is the COVID pandemic, that how the world struggled and also managed to kind of tackle this pandemic. It was mainly through collaboration, and I think that collaborations and also that freedom of sharing results and so on. So I think we'll have to look at it from a holistic perspective of how the academic kind of freedom brings innovations and ideas and imaginations. And I also sometimes think that a world without Albert Einstein or Thomas Edison, or you name it, Newton, or even Sir Tim Berners-Lee or Steve Jobs, I think then the world would have been different. So these are people who have really taken those risks and came forward with ideas, and they were probably aware of the potential risks that involve, I mean, in terms of all these innovations, etc. But we also have a very important responsibility of current and future generation, because we are transferring these knowledge to our to a cohort of young people, and therefore we need to really make sure that we impart the right knowledge and so on. But again, I have personally confronted some circumstances, especially, for instance, when I was teaching global health issues. I have actually said that, well, look, anytime a pandemic could occur. I mean, that was exactly the thing that I mentioned in probably about October of 2019. And then here comes in January, we had a new pandemic. And then some students started using social media, for instance. Now, social media, I think, and also other means like of promoting these the academic matters have created also challenges, because that's where you have to draw the line. And if you don't draw the line, then I think we could end up in trouble, because you're not just destroying the reputation of the individual academic, but also the institution, and more generally the society as a whole as well, because sometimes there are ethical standards to follow, and also sometimes things go beyond our control. one classic example is actually a study. I don't want to name the individuals or anything. They in England, they established an association between autism and MMR vaccine. So what happened is that a cohort, I mean, that was a study that was conducted following their own ethical standards. Probably somewhere it went wrong, and the result was that, here is a huge, big conclusion, that is that there is a causal relationship between, vaccine and autism, that led to a cohort of mothers and their children. They didn't really, they didn't vaccine their children, and then you had an outbreak of measles and so on. So the point here is that, well, you will have to really take care of all these, I think, particularly scientific research, with caution, and so that and also responsibly. That responsibility comes because it's natural for any academic, I think, especially researchers, to really find pathways to impact in, probably sometimes through shortcuts, saying that, well, look, I found something, let me reveal this to the world, let me generate that impact. But sometimes we forget the fact that there could be ramifications of those reflections. So I would say that, well, in more generally, I think, everyone sort of behaves responsibly, but sometimes, there are certain occasions or circumstances we cross the line, and that's where we need to really, be careful. So there was one instance, one example of actually freedom of expression, because in academia, I think that's where we have all the freedom to express ourselves, and also that's what we encourage our students to do as well. So once there was actually a campaign regarding anti kind of religion, or so for instance in the Israel context, anti-Semitism. I think that was actually that a conference was actually sitting up within the campus, and we had to stop that, because I think that regardless of that, that's where that's where you cross the line, and because any outcomes of that conference could potentially lead to political disasters, or even sometimes wars, as we see. So therefore we have to be very, very cautious. And also with students, I think we have a moral responsibility. We are actually educating them. I mean, of course, we are actually empowering them with knowledge, subject knowledge, technical knowledge, etc. But more importantly, we have to also impart the values. That's where the institution plays a key role in bringing certain values. So if the academic members or the students follow those values, then I think you are very unlikely to really go off the rail. But I would say that, well, sometimes institutions don't oversee these things, these matters. Sometimes we have to really look at it on an ad hoc basis based on depending upon circumstances. But there has to be a systematic way of handling or managing academic freedom, for which actually the institutional leadership is very crucial. I think I'll stop at that point and hand over to the next colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Gitanjali. Thank you for this very kind introduction. Thank you for putting together the panel and inviting us. I'm very grateful to be here and really look forward to the insights that our conversation will reveal. So the first thing that came to my mind when I was invited for this panel was a big alarm bell that said, Alex, as a constitutional lawyer, don't make the mistake and bring in too much law, legalize the conversation, the whole thought patterns then usually get expressed in terms of rights and violation of rights. So I want to make sure that although I will be speaking about law cases, it's not that I want to encourage a legalization of the topic. And I don't want to bring legal, administrative, or regulatory questions into the foreground. I actually think the most important word to describe academic freedom for me is the word trust. Trust in the individual and trust in the institution. And then there are also other words I'm thinking about which are explicitly non-legal, like community, curiosity, or civility, which can be exceptionally important for framing our debate of academic freedom. So My ideal type of academic freedom would not be a world without boundaries for academic freedom. And certainly not a world without disputes about these boundaries. I just would hope, or sort of the ideal type of academic freedom would be a world in which those boundary disputes are resolved through civil communication, mediation, and processes that reinforce our trust. Once the university administration gets involved, or even worse, lawyers and courts, already a lot has been lost. Okay, two stories I wanted to narrate. One is from the Constitution of Germany, going back in history and time, and one from the University of Berkeley in the United States. So please keep in mind this caveat that I want us to go beyond laws and constitutions, but now I'll talk about the field that I feel a little bit competent to speak about. So if you think about Germany, you can think about Imperial Germany from the 1870s to the end of the First World War as a country which was exceptionally successful in terms of its university and research output, even if academic freedom in the social sciences, etc., might not have been high on the agenda. So there might have been a very high degree of scientific freedom or support for specific research institutes, right? And don't forget that Einstein wrote the general theory of relativity during the First World War at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, which later on became the Max Planck Institute. Yeah, but we wouldn't think of that time period as committed to academic freedom in the sense that we understand it today. And I think that's also interesting that the Weimar Constitution, which comes after the First World War, guarantees scientific freedom and freedom of the arts. It's not expressed, they don't use the word academic freedom. Neither does the German Constitution after the Second World War. Every German constitutional lawyer will say what we take away from Weimar is sort of, there was too much freedom. There was no protection against the enemies of the Weimar Constitution, and the political scientist Löwenstein, who had to migrate to the United States from Germany, he coined the term militant democracy. And so this idea of militant democracy really informs German constitutional experience after the Second World War. So there's a lot to be said about this, but in Germany, political parties can be banned. It's a highly complicated process that involves the Constitutional Court. And in the 1950s, they banned a right-wing political party that understood itself sort of as a neo-Nazi party right after the war. And they also banned the Communist Party. In that sense, there is an important limit on academic freedom in Germany, since a lot of professors are civil servants, that you cannot be a professor at a regular state university if you are a member of the Communist Party. And I think this ban is still in place today. Okay, so that's sort of the story in Germany, where the limit upon academic freedom, or the most, this maybe sort of the key point that we can take away from this, is that it's the membership in an organization. It's not so much a question about the sort of speech or your scholarship or something that that you might, or what happens in your classroom. It's really that membership in that Communist Party, and the process for banning the groups where membership then leads to your ban, to your teaching ban. That process is highly elaborate. In the United States, we have something that we can compare. In 1969, the Board of Regents of the University of California fired Angela Davis. Angela Davis is one of the leading scholars with respect to racial theories, integrated race, gender, class studies, and really emerges as a powerhouse for academic innovation in the United States. But she's fired because she's a member of the Communist Party. She was also a member of the Black Panthers, and she had experienced racial segregation growing up in Alabama. That was ruled as illegal by the court. That's sort of a time in the late 1960s but then 2 years later, so first she's fired, that is declared illegal. And then 2 years later, her contract is not extended. And then is the question why her contract is not extended. And the University of California, they don't give any reasons. But it's pretty obvious that her political activism and the content of her lectures were highly relevant for that. So what are the lessons that I draw from this? I think the lesson that I draw from this is that it might not be wise to look for the regulation of speech, right? That could be really counterproductive because we cannot regulate our way out of that. Academic speech, if we try to classify it through a regulatory regime, and here I borrow from Padmadas, he said this really well in a recent lecture, what you would have is that you have a competitive politics of mobilization, asking for more and more regulation. So in that sense, I don't think the pathway is the regulation of speech. What we maybe can take away from the German case is the very high level of process of who do we sort of ban from the pluralistic debate. Yeah, all the constitutional court judges have to get involved. And then membership in these groups is not a one-off. It's not, it's not something, a wrong tweet or a misleading lecture or a hypothesis with nuances that you try to explore. It's sort of a repetitive conduct. You might pay membership fees and everything else. So that would be sort of a key lesson that I draw away from this. And this also leads me to my conclusion. You can construct academic freedom as an extension of regular freedoms like free speech, political and civil liberties. I don't think that's very helpful. I think it's more to do with freedom in itself. I think it derives more from the institutional autonomy, the freedom of professions, or if you go further back in time in Europe, the guilds, and the privileges that these institutions. My academic freedoms are rights, but they're also privileges, right? I mean, I choose my own teaching, I choose my own research topic. I have these wonderful time periods of teaching. None of my friends has all these privileges. And therefore, I think our debate at some point of time also has to involve the question, how do we justify these privileges? So how would be that I understand it? There are consequentialist explanations. Academic freedom leads to better research output, leads to better science, leads to a better society. That we could question, right? I mean, Jindal University could say to me, why are you writing a paper on this weird aspect of comparative constitutional law or legal history? Why don't you do something more valuable with your time? So, but there's also the deontological explanations. And I think our commitment in these institutions to the pursuit of truth, this is a very complicated concept in itself, or maybe we can say truths, or our commitments to specific types of methodology and falsification. I think that could provide a justification for academic freedom. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Alex, and for providing something of a history as well of academic freedom. I was just thinking as you were saying that, so there seem to be different kinds of freedom at play here, right? So what is that? Academic freedom seems to be a bunch of freedoms. So freedom to do certain things in the classroom, freedom to do your own kind of research, freedom to have your own politics and to be part of political institutions, freedom to be, there's a lot going on there. So I hope that we get to discuss some of that during the question and answer session. But thank you so much. So we've got John back. So John, can I ask you to?
The freedom to think, write, teach. And indeed, as Alexander points out, I think many of us do have extremely privileged positions in which we do have, in fact, a great deal of freedom to do exactly that. But when I think about the notion of democracy in relation to universities, I always think of two slightly different things. One is, in fact, the autonomy of universities as institutions in themselves. That is to say, the extent to which an individual university is, in fact, a democratic institution in which its members whether they be faculty, administrative staff, students themselves, in fact, do have a voice in the way in which the institution functions. And in my own experience over the years, I've been in really very different universities in various capacities, from those which are extremely open to internal debate about their structure and organization, what they might teach and how they might teach it, and those that are really the other end of the spectrum, and actually where there's very little input from faculty or students to shaping those kind of things. That's one aspect. The other aspect is, I think some of you are probably familiar with the work of the distinguished American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, of course, has written about the role of the universities themselves in promoting and maintaining. Sorry. Okay, where was I? So, yeah, I was talking about this relationship, in other words, between the kind of internal democracy of an institution and the broader democracy of the society. And I think that's an important interface that we should also explore. When we talk about the stakeholders, I mean, again, this notion that Alexander's just raised about, in a sense, responsibility. We're paid by somebody. We have a constituency that we should be addressing in various ways. And what I would want to suggest at this point is that our notion of that constituency and our responsibility has broadened. And it's broadened in relation to some of the issues that Sabu raised. For example, if we think about the SDGs as forming a kind of framework about wider responsibilities to the kind of global community and to the kind of planetary society, whatever we should call it, which we're a part, I think to some extent this redefines the nature of the university. That our constituency is not simply our local stakeholders, whether they be government or our private capacity, or whether in fact it's a much more planetary notion of what we should be addressing. And I really would like to introduce that issue into the conversation a little bit. In doing that's one issue. But I think when we talk about our own responsibility, as we're all teachers or administrators or both in some way or another, it's to raise a question which I don't know, again, is much discussed in this context, which is the notion of trust. And I think this is a multi-dimensional thing too. I mean, I would like to think that as a teacher and researcher, I'm trusted to be responsible about the kind of nature of the themes that I take up, the way I present those, whether it's in research findings or in my teaching. And at the same time that I can trust the management of my institution to allow that kind of work to take place. I mean, I think universities are actually one of the few institutions, I think, left in modern society in which, imagination has relatively free play. There aren't many places, and I think that's an incredibly important thing. And I think therefore, it's a question on the one hand of being responsible to expounding that kind of imaginative possibilities in ways which are conducive to, to social outcomes, to social benefits. But at the same time, to be trusted in certain cases to allow imagination to kind of free play in such a way that we don't know what the outcomes will be necessarily. Given the movement towards research outcomes, what can you show us that there will be a definite goal, a definite outcome for this in terms of social policy, or I guess in the sciences, in terms of technological or scientific results from this. I think we should accept the idea that we don't always know, but that the responsibility of the use of that space in which we can try out ideas which may or may not prove to have a practical outcome is incredibly valuable. I say, because I think we are in a position where we're in one of the few, possibly only institution, which still allows that kind of freedom. That is, in fact, a very important part of the way in which we conceptualize academic freedom itself. There are, of course, boundaries to that, but I think those boundaries should be fairly broad because when we look at the nature of any kind of scientific or discovery in other non-science subjects as well, they are often the unexpected outcome of something else. And I think allowing that space to function in such a way that gives us a kind of lack of closure is something I personally find incredibly valuable. I mean, I sometimes think it would be terribly hard to give up a career in universities because I can't think of many other places where I'd be allowed to do those things without anybody breathing down my neck all the time asking, well, what are the results? And say, well, I don't know, but let's wait and see. They may not appear immediately, but hopefully they will appear in the long run to prove valuable, not only in the narrow sense of utilitarian applicability, but in a much broader sense of the expansion of our kind of intellectual universe. So let me stop with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and for putting that back on the table, that the university is really one of the last places where you can allow a certain kind of imagination to really, run. So may I invite Professor Bhattacharya now to make his comments?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Freedom in academics, we believe that they go hand in hand. I personally, I wouldn't be in academia if we didn't have the priceless autonomy or freedom that we have enjoyed throughout our career. I'll start with some generic views and then later I'll move on to some specifics. And I'm sure Gitanjali will stop me somewhere. We all have expressed this already that new knowledge can't be developed unless we, the academic community, we enjoy freedom and institutional autonomy, of course. So again, we add to that only a culture and atmosphere of democracy that can foster quality higher education. That's also a given. I don't think we can debate on this. It also plays a key role, the freedom that is in allowing societies to innovate. Today, innovation has taken a huge shape. Particularly in India, there is huge energy in that. And we want to elaborate on that, to innovate, to, if you will, understand and grow intellectually, to critically reflect, all these attributes and resolve issues. You need these are the bread and butter attributes for any good university, if you will. And without university, I think a lot of people have commented this way, that the universities would become sort of ivory towers of doctrine and dogma rather than research, where academics cannot fulfill their role in society. That's also connected. So if universities or the faculty members of the universities, researchers, non-faculty researchers, everybody, if they have to fulfill and play a role in the society, they solve societal problems and make an impact, this attribute is a given again. Otherwise, students can't develop independent minds either. I mean, we have seen results in not so good universities. Some, John mentioned at the other end of the spectrum, right, in his experience. So here are a few observations and a few enabling thoughts, if you will. But most of my comments are with India as the context. I restricted myself on that. Autonomy and accountability. Some people have described, I've seen in the literature, as complementary functions and so on. There can be a debate on that. But obviously, one has to strike a balance, a decent balance between the two. But what I say now, I mean, in my humble experience in this country as a faculty member, as an educator, as well as an academic administrator, the Indian regulatory bodies appear to have overdone it to ensure accountability. That's a general experience. If you, more often than not, you'll get that impression. The surprising element in this opinion is that everybody seems to agree on that, and nobody seems to do anything about it, including the ones who are supposed to do something about it. It seems to be an impossible job. I don't know why. It's a very confusing and perplexing thing, etc. Both Alex and John talked about, you mentioned trust, and so there appears to be a huge lack of trust between the academic institutes and the regulator, at least in India. I mean, you can't do a policing job in this relationship, can you? And that's what we see. And I'm probably using harsh words, but you get the sense of it that you can't just do sort of standing in the tall tower and watch, the sort of a watchman job, etc. This is very sad in my experience. This is very sad, particularly for good institutes. Fortunately, I have been associated with excellent institutes in my short career. Let me draw an analogy, to, if you will, private capital. It flows. A lot of people talk about it in business when you have ease of doing business, right? A lot of state governments give advertisements, full-page advertisements in newspapers that we are number one, number two in ease of doing business in this country, and so on, because it fosters competition and product quality improves and so on. That's in business. But when it comes to higher education in India, everybody seems to agree, as I said, that we need less regulation, but it seems to be nearly an impossible task as to how we can ease this sort of stifling regulatory measures that we have presently, at least for the good institutes. Again, quite baffling in my humble opinion. So how can you do a bit of ease of doing education, ease of doing research? I think we need to create some parameters on this, quantified. And if you turn it around and see what happens when you have ensured much less regulation, even in this country, as I said, relatively, the picture is quite encouraging. The proof is right there. The accountability is nicely evident as well. So there are some type of institutes. I have worked for 30 years in one such. The success of the IIT, I don't know how many of you are familiar, Indian Institutes of Technology, which is one of the brighter spots of higher education in this country. That model is often, the success of that model is often attributed to the lovely autonomy that they have enjoyed compared to the universities. And the funding, of course, but that's a different story. Universities, sadly, they fail to enjoy that level of autonomy, and the results are not difficult to see. Let me share a bit of statistics on this. If you take very quickly, I'm not a great believer in ranking, but I'm using this to my advantage now. NIRF, National Institutional Ranking Framework, the government ranking process in India, not QS, not THE. And if you look at the top 100 in that list, a significantly larger, so you have IIMs, Indian Institutes of Management, the IITs, the ISERs, IISERs, the Science, Education and Research Institutes. These are all government, good cream institutes. You'll see that 45% of the IIMs, 70% of the IITs, and nearly 60% of the ISERs. The numbers are not important, but the level at which it's around and more than well over 50%. They are in the top 100, and they enjoy great autonomy, these institutes. I know this firsthand. But if you move to the other side, the central universities, they're also government. 24% of the central universities in the top 100. Deemed to be university, 20% in the top 100. State universities, 6% in the top 100. Private universities, 2% in the top 100. So you clearly see that, 60, 70 range, and then 20 and below, even single digits. So the over-regulation didn't help, did it? We believe that we have done an absolutely fabulous job of policing, and then we ended up hurting the system, didn't we? Of course, there are other, I'm oversimplifying the process. I'm not saying that regulation was the only culprit to hurt this, but to a great extent it is, from my experience. So, if you look at post-2009 established institutes, the newer institutes, 2009 and later, those who came about, there are 16 central universities which are established, and only none of the 16 are in the top 100, right? So again, the university model. But if you look at the other ones, the IIMs, the IITs, 3 IIMs are in the top 100, which are established in post-2009. 3 new IITs are in top 100. And, 4 of the ISERs and 1 NIPER, again, a pharmacy education research institute, again, all government. These are new institutes post 2009. They are in the top 100. I think there is ample evidence where statistically, valid sampling size and all that stuff, you almost get to the conclusion that, yes, seems to be, that we have a point. So the conclusion is pretty obvious. The higher education, the regulation is almost assaulting the autonomy of the good institutions. That's, I'm not talking about poor institutions. So that's one. And let me take another observation that's not often heard. I'm raising a very, very sensitive issue now. I might lose my job. Let me see. Why don't we ever audit the regulators and the accreditation agencies? Why do we assume that they are perfect? Why don't we do some disruptive reform there? Why don't we review their SOPs? Why don't we look at the quality of individuals, who are involved in the operations of these? This is, I can go on and on, but Gitanjali won't permit, not just the time, the content as well. So we need superior intellectual inputs in the design of such systems, operation of such systems. I think we need cerebral inputs. We had enough of it already. Let's look at a few other countries. Of course, in the interest of time, I'll just mention USA. Some of you have worked in those countries. I have studied only in that country. And, the public universities are administered by the individual states. And the central regulatory mechanism simply doesn't exist. Accreditation does, but no regulatory body, if I understand it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong. So does a typical US university spend so much time in interpreting new regulations that almost seems like coming one every week or one every month or so, and in such a rapid frequency? I also mentioned the role played by AAU, Association of American Universities, in the USA. It works closely on one hand with the federal government, on the other hand, it works with the universities, with the government to harmonize, to streamline, to whenever possible eliminate unnecessary regulations and reporting requirements. It's just so, it needs to be, very light and all that, and also helps the member universities to review their existing policies and procedures. So it plays a very positive role. Can we expect AIU to play that same role? Will it be allowed to play that role in India? That's a question I raise. So let me quickly briefly. I don't know how much time do I have. I think almost there. Yeah.
Can we wrap up in a minute?
Yeah. So there is this report so the German and the Swedish institutes publish Academic Freedom Index Update 2023. So there it's kind of very disappointing and discouraging results that they study 179 countries and academic freedom is in retreat for over 50% of the world's population, 4 billion people, considering those universities. So 22 countries, and unfortunately it includes India, China, USA as well, and Mexico, where universities and scholars, they enjoy significantly less freedom than what they enjoyed 10 years back today, at end of 2022. So that's not good. Everything it seems to have progressed. It has improved in only 5 small countries, which benefits a mere 0.7% of the global population. That's not good news, but it's a good alarm for us to wake up and take some action. India is in the bottom 30% of that population. So I stop here. Maybe we'll get some other opportunity to add to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. Among the many, I think, wake-up calls you issued, I thought the one that I was very interested in was, if we're going to think about universities of the future, and we're thinking about universities as important to the future, then why aren't we also thinking about what regulatory bodies should be looking like in the future, whether we should have them at all? Let's move on to our last speaker today. Ms. Brown, I invite you to make your comments.
I think before I go there, I just want to answer the last question. We're currently going through a higher education accord, which is really looking at the whole premise and necessity and purpose of higher education and universities in Australia. I'm delighted to say they've just put me on the panel to look at the regulator. So I'm going to be on the panel that actually looks at what the regulator should look like in the future, and how that should be agile, and how that should mirror what we want the university of the future to be look like. So I think that's a good start off, Gitanjali, saying that different countries are at different stages in the evolution of looking at universities and their role in the future, and I'm delighted to be part of that. I'm going to very, very stick to time. In fact, I might give you some time back because it's really important. We've got time for questions, and I've actually found it really useful. So thank you for inviting me to listen to my colleagues and what they're saying across the board. But I think I would want to say straight from the start, we're all talking from the same premise. We're all talking from universities that are in countries that are democracies. So we're all talking from countries that fundamentally believe in their political system and the right for freedom of debate and the right of diverse opinions. And if we were probably involving a few other countries that didn't have that right, far less the right to access to higher education, we might be having a different debate. So I think it's really important, and I think a few of my colleagues have said that, to recognize where we're starting from and the privileged position that we are starting from around the debate, not only the debate about academic freedom, but also the debate around autonomy versus accountability. And I believe, being Scottish, you can have both. You can have autonomy and you can have accountability and you can have freedom of speech. But it's how you meld that together, and you're very upfront about that, is really important. So after saying that, Australia is really interesting. Australia never had any legislation, which is crazy, around academic freedom until 2021. Can you believe that? 2 years ago was the first time that we actually had legislation that legislated for freedom of academic integrity in universities. And really that only came about because of 3 or 4 different situations that we had, which ended up in legal situations. So again, thank you to our colleague there taking the legal perspective, where we had some situations which were political, where people were in teaching. Interestingly, the legal situations that we've had in Australia aren't research. We haven't had a lot of issues around freedom of speech around research, because it goes through the ethics committee. It's so well monitored. It has a set of standards that need to be adhered to. So we've not had many legal situations around research and free speech. We have around teaching and free speech, okay? So the 3 that brought to play, I suppose, our legislation in October 2021, where there was a public lecture on incidences of rape by a commentator at Sydney University. There was concerns about academic integrity being compromised, as a private foundation, the Ramsay Foundation, wanted to create a centre on Western civilization. And the third thing was really around, I suppose, debate around Taiwan being an independent area or part of China. And therefore, we saw a lot of funding being taken out of Australian universities because of that debate. That really brought 2 things into play. The first thing that it brought into play was in 2021 was a free speech code for universities, which all universities didn't have to, under legislation, sign up for. I think out of the 43 universities, all universities have now signed up for that. But it was part of their charter and part of the individual university to sign up, not government legislated. And the second thing that happened was that there was actually a case held, which was amazing, in Australia, where an academic was sacked because at one of our regional universities, they rejected a link, which was a scientific link, that showed that human activity had been diminishing the barrier reef. So there was a sustainable debate about human impact on the barrier reef. And the academic was sacked, and the law actually withheld that sacking. they said they didn't have a right to opinion in that point of view. So it was a really interesting time for Australian universities. From 1957, we always had a law around independence of universities, but that was only around politics. That was only around political statements and was about a political environment, and that universities had to be truth-telling. But I find it absolutely amazing that it wasn't until 2021 that we actually had any legislation or any drive to ensure that free speech was supported in universities, which is incredible when you actually think about all our other colleagues on this debate who absolutely have driven forward the case for having free speech in universities, being an academic, the free right to opinion, and our debate and what we're trying to engender in students around curiosity, knowledge, and independence. So I suppose I want to go back to the purpose that we were talking about today, which is about autonomy versus accountability when we look at free speech. I actually think you can have both, but I really want to be upfront about saying there has been a few cases in my own university and in other universities where people have hidden behind free speech due to bigotry, racism, sexism, all the isms that you and I would not find acceptable. So I really believe in free speech, but I don't believe in it when you diminish something of a higher order around diversity or respect or ethics. And I think there's a very fine line there where we have had some instances where people have hidden behind free speech around trying to drive a particular agenda that is very damaging to community or damaging to individuals. And we just don't condone that. So if I go back to our perspective on free speech and institutional autonomy as the first proprietary owned private university in Australia, and the only one out of 43, it's even more critical for us that we ensure that we are supporting autonomy and accountability. Yeah, that we are making sure that it is really clear. And I think freedom of speech and also institutional autonomy is essential in building the character, ethos, direction, and purpose of a university. Now, they aren't all the same, okay? So one of the debates that we're having here is around free speech and is around autonomy and is around accountability. But my view is there is a baseline for a university around knowledge, around wisdom, around application of knowledge, around commercialization, around social impact, that everybody has to be a university. But then on top of that, there is differentiation. And we should celebrate that differentiation and not celebrate mediocrity. So autonomy for me is about differentiation. It's about making sure that you're really clear what your impact is, where your areas of expertise are, where your areas of expertise are around research, and more importantly, what your purpose is. And that is really critical in ensuring that when an academic joins you or a researcher joins you, they know the ethos of the organization and they know the strategy and the purpose of the organization. And it's really important that that fits, you know, especially if we're talking about things like ethics, okay? So I also think that if you like, the perspective around institutional autonomy is it does provide the opportunity for the university to define itself. And as I say, that's a baseline for all universities across the world, but there has to be focus and priorities in that. And sometimes I think it's really, really clear, if you look at the situation that I talked about with James Cook, they have a particular research expertise around sustainability and environmental impact. That's very clear and very upfront. Should that academic have been allowed to have a different opinion? I do believe they should have. But when it went to court, the court then backed the university because they had been really clear about what their ethos was, their mission was, their purpose was. And the academic viewpoint, without any substantial backing, it was just an opinion, which we all have, was detrimental to the university and the university strategy. So that's, I think, part of the problem around academic freedom, is that universities need to be much clearer in defining their boundaries, their ethos, their purpose, the things that they are clearly curious about, debating about, research about, not the outcome, not saying what that should be, but certainly setting some parameters to be really fair to people who join them. Or else you get that conflict, and that conflict can be detrimental not only to the institution, it can be incredibly detrimental to the community and to the academic, because no academic wants to get in a fight legally with their institution or with their community. I think also universities claiming this opportunity, the opportunity to have autonomy and accountability, need to establish that basis, as I've said. So it should be acknowledged that it always manifests in a specific context. Yeah, it's not something you can talk about across every university looking the same and being administered in the same way. I think it's really critical that it's a really important part of the manifesto, if you like, about the university and the strategy about the university. And they're really, really upfront about that, because that's what creates a need for accountability. I don't think the accountability necessarily is just the regulatory domain, although they obviously have an important part. But I think it's really, really important that the institution creates the context for which it expects to support, to fund, to promote, to help academics really, really research and have a particular point of view. So for me, I think the thing that I would want to finish on is I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think it's autonomy versus accountability. I think you can have both, as long as you're super clear about what your purpose, your structure, your ethos is. And for me, academic freedom is a given. It's been something that's been important in universities since universities were created, although governments are getting much more clever in tying it into things like foreign security. I don't know what's happening in India, but certainly in Australia, universities now have to declare all research projects that could be seen as national security projects with certain countries. It's happening in America that they're looking at funding for research, etc. So it's very easy, I think, for government to intervene in freedom of speech by hiding behind foreign investment and foreign security. But I think it's really up to the universities itself to define its purpose and its objectives, not its voice, but what it stands for, to make sure that we don't get in situations where academics, unfortunately, find themselves in court fighting with their institution around different opinions. So I think that accountability is not just the regulator, it's also the institution. And I think it's incredible to me, having looked at this for this talk this evening, so thank you for that, to recognise that 2021 was the first time ever that Australia put into legislation academic freedom. Isn't that crazy? When universities have been around for how many years? So interesting debate. Thank you. I really enjoyed listening to my colleagues, and I've learned lots, which is always good. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Torrens. I think what I really learned from your talk was just how clear, what the responsibilities of the institution as well, especially in terms of putting across what the goals are, what the values are. I think sometimes a new university might sort of be figuring it out as they go along, and in which case that process too might need to be thought through a bit more carefully, perhaps, how they would do that collaboratively, if at all. but also a strong sense of what the goals are. So thank you very much. We have had such a wonderful set of comments here and a lot of ground covered. I thought before we kind of look at the questions we have already thought about, we could look at our audience questions. So the first question is, and I'm just going to read it out verbatim, if that's okay. Regulators are appointed by government. Even university VCs or vice chancellors are appointed by government for a lot of public institutions. Governments are thin-skinned, unlikely to tolerate much criticism. Can we realistically expect any academic freedom in these circumstances? Not even sure that that's strictly an India-related question, but maybe I could ask Professor Bhattacharya to sort of take a stab at this one. But anybody could feel free to comment.
Who is going to give me protection after I respond? No, I'm just kidding. I would like to take a very hopeful and positive view on this. We have had great leaders in the public system. I know large number of IIT directors who are some of the best minds in the country. They were appointed by the government, and but if you see that the process is being interfered with, etc., that has happened, and I'll wait for a turn of events, and then the next one will be better, and things like that. So there is no assumption in the fact that if government appoints somebody, there will not be any freedom, etc. That's not a given. And there are wonderful examples, but of course there are bad examples, which the person who has raised this question must have faced that or experienced that. I agree, but those are I would like to see those as aberrations. Don't you think that there are bad examples in the private sector also? There are large numbers. So there are excellent appointments in the private sector. I can't comment on the regulation part of the regulator appointment, etc., because let's say debated. So, but let me just restrict myself on that. So there are bad public universities and there are bad private universities. The ownership doesn't really matter anymore. There are wonderful trains today. We maybe, if we have opportunity to answer other questions. There are wonderful trains today in the private sector where the ownership is of different kind, and that makes me very, very hopeful for the future.
Yeah, I think sometimes the fact that we're also tiptoeing very carefully around questions like this itself reveals something about the nervousness of our times and reflects on that academic freedom issue. Our next question is the love for publications and rankings pushing the faculty to ask questions that are publishable, but not ones that are important? And can I ask, I'm sure we all have comments on this, but can I ask Professor Padmadas to maybe comment?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Gitanjali. I think, well, that's a very good question, because I think there is actually that drive towards, excellence. And I think sometimes, people do find certain, routes which can be shortcuts. And I think, but most of the funded research, as you may know, I think that's increasingly happening everywhere. I mean, in India as well, I think very much so, is that when you submit a proposal, let's say a research grant proposal, then you are obliged to really comply with certain formalities that are also particularly includes that ethical, it has to go through the ethics and so on. So I think there is actually definitely, there is a framework in place where you will have to tick all the boxes and to make sure that, well, whatever you're doing is actually, there is an academic integrity that is followed into that exercise. If something goes wrong, then I think going back to previous point, which I have been, first of all, I think I should also mention that I've learned a lot actually from our distinguished speakers and colleagues. I think, it's been enlightening. And I think what we need is actually, we need forums like this to really bring out. This is the first time I'm hearing that there is a forum to discuss autonomy versus accountability. And I think, so coming back to the point that at the end, who is responsible is, of course, the individual, the researcher who is actually taking that course of action is responsible, but also equally the institution, particularly the vice chancellor or the director of whoever is responsible for that institution has to take the accountability, because that's where it becomes very sensitive and critical, which also brings to one important point that we have a responsibility to educate our community, our academic community more widely, and then make everything transparent. Like, in terms of you have certain areas that you need to be very careful with, but at the same time, I think you have to follow certain procedural or certain regulations which have been entrusted by the institution. I think once we break that, then I think, at the end, I think the individuals will have to bear the consequences. Of course, the institutional damage, it'll take some time before we can actually rectify it. But I have seen that, well, in my own institutions, people resigning from the post because of certain, it's not the malpractice, but because of circumstances, they are forced to commit certain, behaviors which are unacceptable, which are socially unacceptable, which are politically unacceptable, and so on. We also have a responsibility towards our students. I think, well, for instance, when we talk about, I think one important thing is regarding Ukraine situation. And I think people who are involved in this global security, so you will have to really bring in a balanced view to really present that. Any papers that is written on this particular situation in Ukraine will have to really bring that balance. Otherwise, what will happen is that there is already a bias which can be a conscious or unconscious, that will have huge implications. So coming back to the research publications, I think it's very important that, and that's why I quoted the example of MMR and autism. It literally affected children, at the end. So these actions can have long-term consequences in the society, and it can actually damage the reputation and also damage a country as a whole. There was actually, one quick kind of reflection is that, well, one of my colleagues, I think, who's a very, he unfortunately passed away, but he was the head of statistics office, UK government statistics, and he was actually going to release an important finding that could have potentially brought the government down. And well, it almost brought it down, but you have to exercise caution. And then you have to have consultations. You have to have internal consultations. You have to have probably legal consultations before you take those steps forward. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a bunch of questions and not a lot of time left, but let me just go ahead and ask one more. Anybody could feel free to answer this. So, one of the questions on our list was how can we protect academic freedom in a polarized society? But maybe one of the other ways to think about that is also to think about how, given in light of what you've all said, how do we think about the responsibility of academics in a very diverse society, which may or may not be polarized, but which may be divided on many other lines, caste, class, gender, just region, just to name a few in India, for instance. Would anybody like to Can
I say something on that? And I want to come in
please.
and speak. Academic freedom doesn't mean neutrality, okay? So I think we've got to get past the view that it's about neutrality and being totally independent, totally data-driven, totally research-driven. Academic freedom is okay if you state your opinion. So like any conflict of interest, if you're starting, and everybody is, from a certain point, if you declare that point of interest, it totally changes the debate around academic freedom. Do you know what I mean? So if you have a particular point of view and you put that up front and you declare that, and then you go on to have the conversation or the debate or make the input, I feel that is a lot more genuine and takes away the any lack of integrity for non-disclosure. So it was an interesting thing when I was thinking about the Ukraine situation, and we were talking about that a minute ago. People will have an opinion, they will come from a particular stance. Is it our view, because it's certainly my view, but it might not be all our view, that there is a way to deal with that in the way of the declaration of conflict, because it is almost impossible sometimes to put that aside.
Thank you. And also sometimes it occurs to me, sometimes it's also about the tone in which you convey some of your arguments and your sort of points of view and your research that makes an enormous difference to how it's received as well, you know. Being open
could I
to
please come in
engagement.
to add one more point? Just a quick reflection is that I think there are circumstances that, you know, there are situations where we have these challenges in place. So I think one of the things that probably the academic community in general could do is that, well, to kind of cross-verify and also create, address the problem collectively, because, you know, well, what you need is actually collective leadership, collective governance, so that you know, it's not just that, well, one institution or another institution really standing up on this. So once you mobilize that academic community, for a larger public good, then I think it is possible that you know, and I believe that, well, that is, you know, that freedom of expression, on that freedom has not diminished yet, I think. So I'm very positive and confident about that.
Thank you. You know, sadly, we don't have any time left. And I really feel like with a panel like this, the wonderful issues, all the things that you brought up, the many issues, some of them are not that wonderful, that were raised, we could have had a longer panel, but we could have had a little bit more time to discuss. But I'd like to thank you all for being so thought-provoking in your comments. And I'm sure that all of the people who've been here besides me to listen to you have learned a lot and have a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for taking the time out to join us.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Yeah. Thanks, Gitanjali.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.